listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat here. Welcome to The Briefing. The food we buy at supermarkets all around the country and that our farmers export across the world has a great reputation. Australia's meat, fruit and veg are considered some of the cleanest, greenest produce going around. But this morning, a veteran of Australian farming is blowing the whistle on what he thinks is a major threat to that reputation and a potential threat to our health.
The scientists themselves call it the forever chemical because it doesn't break down in meat or in soil or in grasses or crops. So we need to get a handle on where the impact might be and start to monitor the production in those areas.
Larry Acton has been farming beef cattle for over 50 years. He's the former head of the cattle industry in Queensland, and he's got some very serious concerns to share with us. That chat in the second half of this episode. First though, Katrina Blowers is here with this morning's biggest news. It is Thursday, March 7th.
Hey Sasha, hi everyone, and some pretty big news to start the day. The rematch nobody really wanted is on. Joe Biden and Donald Trump have all but locked in their spots in the 2024 US presidential race. Despite a surprise win in the state of Vermont during yesterday's Super Tuesday primaries, Nikki Haley has now suspended her campaign to become the Republican Party's nominee.
I have always been a conservative Republican and always supported the Republican nominee. It is now up to Donald Trump to earn the votes of those in our party and beyond it who did not support him. And I hope he does that.
Yeah, some pretty pointed comments there from Haley on her way out, adding, now is his time for choosing. Interestingly, Sasha, Haley used to be Trump's ambassador to the US, but then during all her campaigning, she painted her former boss as an ageing, mentally unsound agent of chaos who was unable to respect veterans or service members and unwilling to be faithful to the Constitution. President Biden has already responded to Haley's comments. He's saying, Donald Trump doesn't want Haley's supporters, but he, Biden, is happy to have them and there's a place for them in his campaign. I wonder if any of those sort of more middle thinking supporters of Haley's will switch over.
Yeah, it's a good point. Both sides have kind of made their pitch for Haley's supporters to come on over. It'll be interesting to see where they land, you're right. And of course, this just leaves Trump now that Haley has pulled out, and he won the other 14 states yesterday.
This was an amazing night, an amazing day. It's been an incredible period of time in our country's history. It's been sad in so many ways, but I think it's going to be inspiring because we're going to do something that, frankly, nobody's been able to do for a long time.
That was Donald Trump there saying not really much at all, as he tends to do. Joe Biden, meantime, also swept the votes in the Democratic race, losing just American Samoa by 11 votes. So what happens now? Well, neither candidate will be officially locked in until each party holds its convention. For the Republicans, that's in July, while the Dems will hold theirs in August. Then the campaign for the White House will kick off in earnest ahead of the election on November 5th. It's all happening. And hey, look, I saw some news out of Russia overnight as well. The Kremlin's made a comment saying it won't be interfering in the 2024 election, also saying that it didn't in 2016 and 2020, which we all know now is a plain lie. And Russia's also heading to the polls later this month in what is expected to be a sham election. Alexei Navalny's widow has spoken out ahead of the vote, and she's calling for a protest to happen during the election, which will last for a couple of days at the end of the month. She wants her country people to all show up to polls at the exact same time, midday, and to either vote for any other candidate that's on the ballot or to write Navalny in big letters across the page. So that is another big vote that's happening. Obviously, we pretty much know the outcome already. But Navalny's widow has said, if everyone shows up to polling at the same time, that's not something that authorities can crack down on because it's perfectly legal.
Yeah, and on a much lighter note, Sasha, everyone's been waiting, when it comes to the US election on what Taylor Swift is going to do. And, the reason for that is because she has so many followers and so much sway among young people who I guess, the Democrats were holding out hope that if she endorsed Joe Biden, then that would obviously mean a flow-on effect of millions of votes their way. So yesterday was the presidential primary in Tennessee, and Taylor Swift finally broke her silence on social media about all things US election. It wasn't quite the endorsement that Biden's team had hoped for, though. All she wrote was, "I want to remind you guys to vote for the people who most represent you into power. And if you haven't already, make a plan to vote today." So a little bit wishy-washy there, but this election campaign sadly is still young. A meeting of leaders from across Southeast Asia has wrapped in Melbourne with a watered-down statement which neglects to mention China directly. The ASEAN summit has been happening over the last few days, hosted by Anthony Albanese, who had pushed for attendees to take a strongly worded stance on Beijing's actions in the South China Sea. Instead, though, the statement, which has been endorsed by the 10 nations present, focuses on peace, security and stability in the region. The declaration also includes calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, but omits stronger criticisms of Israel and its conduct. Malaysia and Indonesia had pushed for a stronger statement on Israel, but that hasn't ended up happening.
Yeah, and Anthony Albanese has hailed the summit a success, despite not getting his way with those more strongly worded criticisms of China and its actions in the Indo-Pacific. He says the nations represented had welcomed, though, Australia's plans to ramp up investment in the region. And it is an interesting space in the geopolitical sphere that we're seeing just continue to grow, which is, the Indo-Pacific and Australia's influence in the region. So overall, the PM reckons it was successful. And the slur allegedly used by Sam Kerr towards a police officer in the UK has been revealed by a British tabloid. The Sun is reporting the Matilda's captain called the officer a stupid white bastard during the incident in January last year. Now, Kerr has pleaded not guilty to the racial harassment charge and is set to stand trial, but her legal representatives are trying to have the case dismissed with a court date for that challenge set down in April. If that bid is unsuccessful, the trial will go ahead in February next year. Questions do remain as well, Katrina, over Kerr's Australian captaincy amid the legal case and whether she'll be stood down by Football Australia while the matter is being heard. But we have heard from her English Premier League club, Chelsea, the manager there saying Kerr has the full support of the club.
Yeah, Tony Gustafsson speaking out earlier this week too, saying, that obviously she has his full support too. Really, really interesting to see where this goes.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks so much for being here with me for the headlines today, Katrina. Next up is our deep dive into the forever chemicals that could be in our food.
PFAS is the name that we give to a group of contaminants, sometimes referred to as forever chemicals, because they just don't break down like other stuff does. So what happens if these chemicals get into the land and the waterways and even into our food supply? Well, today we're speaking to a veteran of Australian farming about exactly this concern, PFAS potentially getting into Australian beef. But first, Claire Weaver joins me now. She's our investigations editor here at Listener, and she's done a lot of reporting on PFAS. She's here to break it down for us, even though, as I mentioned, the whole thing about PFAS is that it does not break down. Anyway, Claire, hi. Briefly explain to us what PFAS is.
Hi, Benson. Sure. So PFAS is an umbrella term for a group of thousands of fluorinated chemicals, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And they have very useful properties such as waterproofing. So they've been used in everything from firefighting foams, furniture, carpets and camping gear to non-stick cookware, cosmetics and takeaway packaging. But They are very bad for the environment and known as forever chemicals, as you said, because they don't break down, but they can spread into waterways, land, fish and animals.
So how dangerous is PFAS to human health?
The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer has just put out new evaluations of the two big ones. That's PFOA and PFOS. It's upgraded PFOA to a Group 1 carcinogen, which means it's carcinogenic to humans. PFOS was classified as Group 2B, which means possibly carcinogenic to humans. So PFAS is not benign, but as with any exposure, it's all about the dose. We all have some PFAS in our blood, you, Benson, me, everyone, because it's so ubiquitous and it hangs around in our environment as a legacy or forever chemical after decades of use. So hopefully for most of us, that's not too much.
So it has these potential risks for human health. What about cattle? What does it do to beef?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting that we're talking about cattle today because sick and dying cattle were actually how PFAS was discovered to be causing major problems in the US. Back in 1998, a lawyer named Rob Billett was contacted by a beef farmer called Earl Tennant, whose farm was silently being contaminated by an unknown substance from a nearby DuPont factory in West Virginia. So Earl suspected chemical overflow was to blame for his cattle's dire health problems. Now, after years of investigation, Rob managed to prove PFAS was to blame and subsequently won class actions against DuPont. And a movie was even made about it called Dark Waters, which is really good.
Okay, well, Claire, thanks so much for explaining all that to us. Now, here's my chat with Larry Acton. He's the former head of the cattle industry in Queensland, and he's been farming beef cattle for 52 years. And he's got a lot of concerns about the impact of PFAS on Australian farms and Australian cattle. Larry Acton, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Good morning, Benson.
Why are you taking the risk now of speaking out about PFAS contamination in beef?
I guess for a number of reasons. Obviously, we bought the property in good faith with a magnificent water supply and an underground bore, and found out a few weeks later that that water was contaminated. It was contaminated by this PFAS chemical, which was used by the power station about 4 or 5 kilometres up the valley from where our property is. Our major concern, and the reason why I went public, is that 20 years or 30 years ago, I was on the Cattle Council of Australia executive when we had to deal with chemical residues in beef in our overseas markets, and it was catastrophic at the time. I am concerned at the possibility of this creating a similar issue in one of our markets at some time down the track.
And what have you had to do? You had 100 head of cattle. You've sold them off, haven't you?
We did. As soon as we found out that this was an issue for livestock, what happened was that the power station itself approached us and said that they would supply us with clean water from the town water supply. So they carted water every time we needed it for the house and garden, but they refused to accept that it was an issue for cattle. So my wife said straight away, if we're going to keep breeders here, they'll be there for 10 years, probably longer, some of them, and this chemical is going to build up in the meat. We need to get rid of our breeders and just run young cattle for short periods of time. I had bred Braffords for 52 years, and so we had a really good mob of females, and we were breeding and selling bulls at the national sale. So it was a big decision to make, and it took me 2 years to come to that decision, but eventually in May last year, we sold every last beast off the place.
And now you're running a different type of cattle. Can you explain how that works and why you're less concerned about PFAS in those cattle?
Right now, the cattle that are there are drinking contaminated water. What we have done, instead of having breeders there, we're buying young cattle, so cattle about 8 to 10 months of age, and we keep them on the property for around about 6 months. So we put weight on them and we grow the animal, and then we sell them. And when we sell them, we buy more. So we're doing what they call trading in cattle. The reason that we are so concerned is that the Department of Primary Industries, or Agriculture as it's called in Queensland and federally, at this stage refuse to accept that it's an issue for animal health and for beef. There is a lot of evidence, both here in Australia, in the southern states particularly, but also in America and in other countries, that it is an issue for animal health, and it also is definitely a chemical that builds up in beef.
How do you know that this is something that might be affecting cattle more broadly than your specific farm? You suggested that there was a concern that this might affect the beef industry more broadly.
I definitely do believe that, Benson. We know, for example, that when the research was done in Victoria regarding the country firefighters and their use of this chemical, it also picked up the fact that there were infertility issues in cattle affected by downstream from where this chemical was used. There were calves stillborn and there were deformed calves. If you look at some of the information in the state of Maine in America, in the United States, exactly the same thing occurred, and the state of Maine has accepted their responsibility and is supporting financially the farmers over there and are trying to clean up the act for livestock. My reason for going public in this is to get the authorities in Australia to recognise and start to monitor some of the areas where this may be an issue. We know that this has been used on Defence Force bases around the country. We also know that it's used at power stations, maybe not everyone, but probably everyone around Australia. We know that it's used in major mining operations, probably not everyone, but a lot of them. And we also know that it's been used around major airports in Australia, possibly not everyone, but certainly a big lot. So there is potential for major impact on a lot more cattle than just in one or two little areas.
You've been in this industry more than 50 years. You're a former leader in the cattle industry. What are other farmers telling you about this issue on their properties? Has anyone spoken to you about their cattle also being impacted?
Certainly. The first situation in Queensland occurred almost 20 years ago around the Oakey Air Force Base in southern Queensland. And I've spoken to producers in that area that have had the same impact as myself and have had very little success in getting the authorities to recognise and accept responsibility and then move to do something about it. In terms of the general cattle producer, wherever I go since I went public about this, and obviously I was concerned that I was opening up an issue that could have potential for markets. Some people would say that you're letting our overseas markets know about an issue that it's currently not an issue. Well, my response to that is my experience in the past and even nowadays is that with technology such as what it is, our overseas markets know what we're doing before we decide to do it.
A lot of listeners listening into this right now might not be particularly familiar with the way that agriculture works in Australia, but could you give us an idea of the big picture potential impacts if there is sort of widespread PFAS contamination in Australian beef?
We know now that, for instance, the European Union have set what they call a maximum residue limit for this chemical in meat. So they obviously can and will test any meat going into those European countries for this chemical. If you go back to the 1980s when we had chemical residues identified in beef, actually in overseas markets, when I was involved on the Executive Committee of Cattle Council of Australia, we had meat on boats on its way to America and Japan, and we had meat on the wharves in America unloaded, and they refused to take that meat. We had to put that meat back on the boat, and we had to turn the other boats around and bring them home and dispose of the product. It had a dramatic effect on the cattle market. It had a lot of impact on the confidence of people to eat meat. And that's why we set up a monitoring program and a traceback program and set levels that were acceptable to human consumption, but also to overseas countries and their human consumption. We did all that in a space of a few years, and every animal currently can be traced from where it's produced to where it's slaughtered and where it goes into boxes and where it ends up being sold in retail shops either here in Australia or overseas. All I want is for the authorities to recognise there needs to be some sort of monitoring of this product. This one we're talking about now, PFAS, the scientists themselves call it the forever chemical because it doesn't break down in meat or in soil or in grasses or crops. So we need to get a handle on where the impact might be and start to monitor the production in those areas.
Finally, what's your message to the government and to other industry leaders on this issue?
Please look at the evidence that's available now here in Australia and in the United States, particularly where this product was developed and produced. Please look at that information and act on it.
Larry Acton there. And as you just heard, Larry has concerns that PFAS may not only be affecting his farm and his cattle. We are aware of other Australian farms that have been contaminated with PFAS, and we'll continue to update you with developments on this story as they come to us. That's it for the briefing this morning. Check back at 3, where we'll be speaking with the Health Minister on potential unintended consequences of the government's crackdown on vapes. In the meantime, hit us up on Instagram. If you've got feedback or stories you'd like to see us cover or guest suggestions, send us a DM or even better, a little voice message. I'm Bension Siebert. Thanks for listening.
Listener.